Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. In 1381, a thunderous cry for justice echoed through the streets of London as thousands of peasants, armed with tools and fury, stormed the city in an unprecedented rebellion. Their demand was simple yet revolutionary: fairness, freedom, and a life not crushed under the weight of relentless taxes and feudal oppression. But what drove ordinary farmers, artisans, and laborers to rise up against the most powerful monarchy in Europe? This video delves into the dramatic events of the Peasants Revolt, also known as Wat Tyler's Rebellion, unraveling the complex web of economic hardship, political tension, and social unrest that fueled it. We'll explore the shocking causes, the charismatic leaders, and the powerful institutions they dared to defy. You'll see how a brutal poll tax lit the fuse of a movement already simmering with frustration over war, plague, and inequality. From the explosive march to London to the moment King Richard II stood face to face with the rebels, every twist of this revolt reveals a society on the brink of transformation. Though the uprising was eventually crushed, it sent shockwaves through England that challenged the very foundations of feudal society. The Peasants' Revolt wasn't just a moment of rebellion, it was a turning point that exposed deep cracks in the medieval world and laid the groundwork for the future struggles for justice and human rights in England. In 14th century England, society was rigidly structured under the feudal system, a deeply hierarchical order in which the vast majority of people were peasants bound to the land. These peasants, or serfs, worked long hours on farms owned by the nobility and, in return, were granted just enough food and shelter to survive. They had little to no rights, and their lives were dictated by their lords. Social mobility was nearly impossible, and any resistance to authority was often met with severe punishment. Life was harsh, and survival was a daily struggle. This fragile system was shaken to its core by the arrival of the Black Death between 1348 and 1350. The plague decimated England's population, killing an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the people. While it was a tragedy of immense proportions, the aftermath unexpectedly shifted the balance of power. With so many laborers dead, those who survived found their work in higher demand. Peasants began to ask for better wages, and in some areas, they even had the power to choose where they worked, an unthinkable notion before the plague. However, this new leverage was quickly shut down by the ruling elite. In 1351, King Edward III passed the Statute of Laborers, a harsh law that aimed to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and force peasants to work for the same lords as before. It was a deliberate attempt to stop the economic progress of the lower classes and maintain the old order. For the peasants, it felt like a betrayal. After surviving one of the worst disasters in history, they were punished for trying to build a better life. As the decades passed, discontent simmered. The economic disparity between the rich and the poor grew sharper. Taxes were imposed more frequently and more heavily, especially to fund the crown's costly wars in France. These taxes hit the peasants the hardest, pushing them to the brink. Many began to feel that the entire system was designed to exploit them while protecting the interests of the powerful. Resentment turned into anger, and across the country, the seeds of rebellion began to take root. In 1381, the final spark that ignited the Peasants' Revolt came in the form of the infamous poll tax. Unlike earlier taxes, this was a flat-rate tax, meaning every person over a certain age had to pay the same amount, regardless of their income or status. For England's wealthy elites, it was a minor inconvenience, but for the poor, it was a crushing burden. Already struggling under the weight of economic hardship, the idea of being taxed the same as a wealthy landowner felt like a slap in the face. This tax wasn't just unfair, it was deeply insulting. To make matters worse, this was the third poll tax imposed in just 4 years. The government, desperate to fund its failing military campaigns in France, showed little concern for how the tax impacted ordinary people. Corruption made things worse. Many of the royal tax collectors were greedy and ruthless, using intimidation, threats, and even violence to squeeze every last penny from the peasantry. They would raid villages, demand impossible sums, and publicly humiliate those who couldn't pay, often accusing entire households of lying about the number of taxable individuals. The tipping point came in Essex and Kent. In Brentwood, Essex, Villagers refused to cooperate with tax officials and drove them out with force. At the same time in Kent, when a royal commissioner tried to enforce the tax, he was met with defiance and resistance. In both counties, confrontations escalated rapidly, and what began as local unrest quickly transformed into a widespread uprising. Word spread fast, anger intensified, and peasants began organizing, calling for an end not only to the tax, but to the entire system that had oppressed them for generations. The march to revolution had begun. The revolt erupted with astonishing speed and coordination, catching the English authorities completely off guard. What began as isolated acts of defiance in Essex and Kent quickly evolved into a full-scale uprising that swept across southern England. Villages and towns joined the cause one after another, driven by shared anger over taxation, corruption, and centuries of exploitation. Though many of the rebels were unarmed peasants, their sheer numbers and determination gave them power. They tore through manor houses, destroyed tax records, and executed officials seen as symbols of oppression. The movement was not chaotic. It was remarkably organized for a spontaneous rebellion, with clear messages and coordinated actions. Two figures emerged as the heart and voice of the revolt: Wat Tyler and John Ball. Wat Tyler, a skilled craftsman from Kent, rose quickly to become the rebels' leader. He was charismatic, intelligent, and fiercely committed to justice. Tyler's leadership gave the movement focus and discipline, turning scattered protests into a unified campaign. Beside him stood John Ball, a radical preacher who had long criticized the church and the state for their inequality. His sermons struck a powerful chord with the peasants, especially his famous question, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" Ball's words challenged the very foundations of the class system, suggesting that all men were created equal in the eyes of God. With Tyler leading and Ball inspiring, the rebels set their sights on London, the seat of royal power. As they marched, their numbers swelled into the tens of thousands. They demanded the abolition of serfdom, fair wages, and justice for the poor. This was not just a riot, it was a popular uprising fueled by vision and purpose. As they approached the capital, fear spread among the nobility. The peasants were not only challenging unjust taxes, they were threatening the entire structure of medieval society. The storm was coming, and London was about to face its most dramatic test in centuries. When the rebels reached London in June 1381, the city did not rise to defend itself. Instead, many of its citizens welcomed them. The discontent felt in the countryside was shared by the urban poor, who also suffered under high taxes, corrupt officials, and rigid social barriers. Gates were opened, and the rebels poured into the capital, not as invaders, but as a force, demanding justice. What followed was both dramatic and symbolic. The rebels sought out and destroyed the physical representations of wealth, power, and oppression that had long held them down. One of the most striking acts was the destruction of the Savoy Palace, home of John of Gaunt, the king's uncle and one of the most hated figures in England. The rebels looted and set fire to the grand estate, making sure it burned completely, a fiery message to the nobility that their power was no longer untouchable. But the uprising wasn't just about property. It quickly turned deadly as the Yight. Rebels targeted high-ranking officials responsible for years of misrule. Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Chancellor, was dragged from the Tower of London and beheaded on Tower Hill. His execution, along with others, signaled the rebels' seriousness. They were not merely protesting. They were seeking justice and revenge. Amid this chaos, 14-year-old King Richard II made a surprising move. Rather than send soldiers, he rode out to meet the rebels at Mile End. There, he listened to their demands, which included the abolition of serfdom, fair rents, and the right to work for wages. To many rebels, it seemed like a breakthrough. The king appeared sympathetic and even agreed to many of their demands, at least in words. This moment created a temporary sense of hope, as if centuries of inequality might finally be ending. But beneath this appearance of conciliation, darker plans were taking shape. The storming of London had rocked the kingdom, but the confrontation was far from over. At the heart of the Peasants' Revolt were demands that struck directly at the foundations of medieval English society. The first and most urgent was the end of serfdom, the system that legally bound peasants to the land and their lords. Serfs, had no freedom to move, to work for others, or to own land independently. By demanding its abolition, the rebels were asking not just for economic relief, but for personal freedom on a scale never before seen in England. Alongside this, they called for fair rents and wages. After the Black Death, many peasants had begun to experience the value of their labor, only to have that progress reversed by harsh laws like the Statute of Laborers. The rebels wanted an end to these controls and a return to a system where they could negotiate fair terms for their work and homes. They weren't asking for handouts. They were demanding the right to earn and live with dignity. Another powerful demand was for a general pardon for all those who had taken part in the rebellion. The rebels knew they had committed acts that could be seen as treason, and they wanted legal protection to ensure their movement wouldn't be met with brutal punishment once it ended. This showed their understanding of how power worked and their desire to secure lasting change, rather than a fleeting moment of rebellion. Finally, perhaps the most revolutionary idea of all was the call for equality before the law. In a world where nobles, clergy, and commoners were treated entirely differently by the justice system, this demand challenged the very structure of medieval authority. It wasn't just about taxes or wages anymore, it was about fairness, justice, and the belief that no one should be above the law. These demands, radical for their time, laid bare the deep inequalities in society and revealed a vision of a more just and equal England that would echo through history. The turning point of the revolt came on June 15, 1381, at Smithfield in London. Wat Tyler, still confident in the strength of the movement, met King Richard II face to face to negotiate further terms. It was a tense and symbolic meeting, the leader of England's oppressed facing its monarch. But what seemed like a moment of dialogue turned suddenly violent. Accounts differ, but it's believed that during the meeting, an argument broke out between Tyler and the king's entourage. In the chaos, Tyler was struck down, either by the Lord Mayor of London or royal guards. He was badly wounded and then publicly beheaded shortly after. Tyler's death was a devastating blow. He had been not just a leader, but the rallying figure, who gave the rebellion its structure and resolve. With him gone, confusion and fear spread among the rebels. King Richard, seizing the moment, acted with cunning and speed. He rode out to the remaining peasants and declared himself their leader, promising once again that their demands would be met. Trusting the king's word, many rebels began to disband and return home. But the promises were a lie. Almost immediately, after the rebellion began to dissolve, the crown unleashed a wave of brutal retaliation. Richard revoked all the charters of freedom he had granted, and declared that serfs were still bound to their lords. Royal forces swept through the countryside, arresting anyone suspected of involvement in the revolt. Dozens were executed without trial, some hanged, others beheaded, often as public spectacles meant to terrify any would-be rebels. John Ball was captured, dragged through the streets, and executed as a traitor. Entire villages were punished, and the message was clear: the king would not tolerate rebellion, and any challenge to the feudal order would be met with force. What had briefly looked like a revolution collapsed into a wave of repression. The hopes of thousands were extinguished, but the memory of their stand would not be so easily erased. The Peasants' Revolt had failed in the moment, but it had cracked the facade of divine authority and planted the seeds of future resistance. In the immediate aftermath, the Peasants' Revolt was a failure. The king's promises were broken, the leaders were dead, and the old order was brutally reasserted. The feudal system remained intact, and the peasants returned to their villages under tight surveillance and with heavy consequences. But while the rebellion didn't achieve its goals right away, its long-term impact was far more powerful than anyone could have imagined at the time. Over the following century, the very institution the rebels had fought against, serfdom, began to quietly unravel. The Black Death had permanently altered the labor market, and despite royal efforts to control it, landowners increasingly had to offer better terms to attract workers. By the early 15th century, the traditional bonds of serfdom were weakening across England. Peasants gained more freedom to choose where they worked and to negotiate their wages. The rigid class structure that had defined medieval life began to loosen. The memory of the Peasants' Revolt also left a deep cultural mark. It became a symbol of popular resistance and a touchstone for future movements that demanded social justice and fairness. Though the rebels of 1381 had been crushed, their vision, that all people deserved dignity, freedom, and a voice, endured. In later centuries, reformers, labor movements, and advocates for workers' rights would look back on the revolt as one of the first great uprisings of the common people against systemic oppression. Ultimately, the Peasants' Revolt showed that, even in a world of kings and lords, the voice of the ordinary people could shake the foundations of power. It was a harbinger of the struggles to come, and a powerful reminder that justice is often born in the flames of rebellion. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 is often surrounded by myths that blur the line between legend and reality. One of the most common misconceptions is that it was a chaotic, violent mob without leadership or purpose. In truth, the revolt was surprisingly organized, with clear demands and disciplined leadership under figures like Wat Tyler and John Ball. Tyler wasn't just an angry peasant. He was a skilled negotiator and military leader who kept the movement focused. John Ball, often portrayed as a fanatical preacher, was in fact a radical thinker whose call for equality resonated deeply with the oppressed. Another myth is that the revolt was purely a spontaneous explosion of anger. While the immediate spark was the poll tax, the uprising was the result of decades of growing tension, economic hardship, and social injustice. It wasn't a random riot. It was a calculated challenge to an unjust system. Was it a true revolution? In the immediate sense, no. The revolt was violently suppressed, and most of its goals weren't achieved during the lifetimes of its leaders. But calling it a failed uprising overlooks its deeper legacy. It didn't overthrow the system, but it exposed its cracks. The revolt planted powerful ideas that common people could rise, that injustice could be challenged, and that society could be changed. In that sense, it was the beginning of a longer enduring revolution in the fight for freedom and fairness. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 stands as a powerful moment in history, when ordinary people dared to challenge centuries of injustice and inequality. Though it was crushed in the short term, its impact echoed through time, shaking the foundations of medieval society and inspiring future generations in the ongoing struggle for justice and human rights. This rebellion reminds us that even in the face of overwhelming power, the desire for fairness and freedom can ignite change. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. And tell us, what would you have done? If you lived in 1381, would you have stood with the rebels or stayed silent? Let us know in the comments.